Before I begin, my topic this afternoon is the Liturgical Society of St. James, which existed from 1929 through 1929 to 1947. And it had more influence than you would imagine during the time that it was in existence. This handout that I gave you is sort of the guide through this discussion of the Society of St. James. I first heard about the Society of St. James after it had ceased to exist in 1947. My cousin Elise Fisher, who was a lifelong member of, well, almost lifelong, of Christ Lutheran Church in Washington, now an ELCA parish, she taught at Valpo in the late 40s. And at that time, Dr. Adolf Wismar was a member of the faculty, having been called there in 1945. It was basically the longtime president, O.P. Kretzmann, who wanted Wismar to be there. So Elise was actually involved in the last meeting of the society, and she sang in the choir for the celebration of the Eucharist. My father's cousin, Lula Lewis, a lifelong member of Martini Church, one of her relatives was a man by the name of Luther Miller, who was the son of Dr. Charles A.J. Miller, who was the lay founder of Redeemer Church in Irvington, where our good friend Father Axel now serves. But Luther Miller was very interested in the St. James Society, and so one weekend he took my father's cousin up to Hoboken to experience the Sunday liturgy at St. John's. The first picture you have here is of St. John's Church, Hoboken, and that's where it all began. And the way it came about was that in 1925, Pastor Berthold von Schenk was asked by a missionary person in the Atlantic District, asked him if he would take this over. Von Schenk graduated from St. Louis in 1918, and from 1918 to 1925, he was pastor of Bethesda Lutheran Church in Pine Lawn, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis. But anyway, he was called to St. John's, Hoboken, and he took the call. The church was in terrible shape. There were less than 10 people in church on Sunday morning. But von Schenk, from the time he was in seminary, he had a great interest in evangelism. We think of him mainly as a high church Lutheran, but he really began with a great interest in evangelism. So he came to St. John's, Hoboken, and there was nothing remarkable about their worship. He wore a black gown. But he and several Missouri Synod clergymen in the New York area, they began to meet informally from 1925 to 1929. And it was in 1929 that group of pastors formed the Liturgical Society of St. James. The society was founded, and Bertolt von Schenk was its first leader. Perhaps you may have heard Bertolt von Schenk's full name was lengthy. Berthold Friedrich Ernst Freiherr Schenk zu Schweinsburg. Freiherr, Baron. Bertolt von Schenk was very conscious of his roots in the German nobility. He had sort of an air about him, an authoritative air. It was very hard to say no to him, but his father had emigrated to this country, and that sort of a long name was just impractical. So instead of Bertolt Friedrich Ernst Freiherr Schenk zu Schweinsburg, they just called themselves von Schenk. Von Schenk. They were, in fact, cousins of Count Schenk zu Stauffenberg, one of the German military officers who tried to assassinate Hitler. If you've seen the film that was made about it, I think Tom Cruise played Stauffenberg. But von Schenk was a cousin of his. So for 5 years they met. In 1929, they formed the St. James Society, and it was in 1933 that the first meeting of the St. James Society was held at St. John's, Hoboken. If you turn the page, what you have is a photocopy of the bulletin from the 14th Sunday after Trinity, sometime in the 1930s. And if you look under St. John's Lutheran Church, 3rd and Bloomfield Streets, Hoboken, you'll see von Schenk is pastor, A. Messina is associate pastor, and Carl Bergen is the choir master. This morning's musical setting was a setting of the plain song liturgy, which was edited by Carl Bergen. I only recently learned that Carl Bergen apparently began his association with St. John's as a vicar there, and then apparently was called to be the assistant pastor and choir master. So this is from sometime in the mid-30s. If you have one of those perpetual calendars, you can maybe find out what year it is, because on that Sunday, St. Michael and All Angels' Day fell on a Sunday. You'll notice the hours of worship: 11 a.m. Eucharist, 9:50 Matins in church school, 8:45 German. And then Sunday evening they had Vespers, and they also had an Italian service. And that's why there was a Pastor Messina there. Rather unusual for a Missouri Synod church. If you look on the left-hand side of that page with St. John's Lutheran Church, you see the explanation of the name. St. John's, the name of the forerunner and prophet John the Baptist. Lutheran, we profess the teachings of the historic Lutheran Church because we find them to be the teaching of the Bible. We observe the rites and ceremonies of the old Lutheran Church at the time in use at the time of the Reformation. And this shows one of the basic themes and concerns of the St. James Society, which was to recover the rites and ceremonies of the old Lutheran Church. We all know the sad tale of how, through Reformed influence and the influence of pietism and rationalism, the German Lutheran Church lost a great deal of its liturgical musical heritage. Our good friend Matthew Carver is completing a translation of a book by a German scholar published, I think, around the middle or early part of the last century, Paul Graf. And I'll translate it, the history of the dissolution of the old church rites in the Lutheran Church, Geschichte der Auflösung der altgottesdienstlichen Formen in der Lutherischen Church. So Matthew Carver is translating this book, and CPH will be publishing it. And if you want to know how so much was lost, this is really the definitive study of how that all came about. So we know about that. We know about Reformed influence, Pietism, rationalism, and then in the early 19th century, the Prussian Union. But in the wake of the Prussian Union, there was a revival of confessional Lutheranism in Germany, led by such people as Klaus Harms, Wilhelm Lehe, August Filmar, Theodor Kleefoth. These were some of the great confessional leaders. And along with the recovery of the church's confession, there was also the movement for the recovery of the old Lutheran liturgy. Filmar was very much involved in that. Kleefoth was, and of course Wilhelm Lehe. We're all familiar with Wilhelm Lehe. And Lehe published about 1844 a perfectly wonderful service book called Agenda, which had what, for practical purposes, we would now call the common service, Matins and Vespers. And that first edition of Lehe's Agenda was dedicated to Friedrich Winiken, who at that time was pastor of the Baltimore Mother Congregation. The first pastor of Martini, Karl Franke, 1868-1900, his library, Karl Franke's library, was still on the shelves at Martini in 1965. No one had done anything about it. And the then pastor, Emanuel Albrecht, asked if he thought it would be good if I made a list of all those books and then let the seminaries know what was there. And then as a treat, they said, you can take whatever books you want. So I took a 1634 edition of Chemnitz's Examen Concilii Tridentini. It's a huge volume with pigskin covers and all that sort of thing. And I also took a first edition of Lehe's 3 books concerning the church. But the thing I'll kick myself for forever is I didn't take that first edition of Lehe's Agenda. And I could have done it in good conscience because I knew that the St. Louis Seminary, in fact, had several copies of that, and I assume Springfield, Fort Wayne did too. So anyway, the confessional revival was accompanied by a recovery of the Lutheran forms of worship. We all know that old motto, lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of prayer is the law of belief, and you can also reverse it and say lex credendi, lex orandi. The law of belief is the law of worship. And one way of putting it simply is how we pray shows what we believe. So the St. James Society was very interested in this recovery of Lutheran heritage. If you look on the next page, 14th Sunday after Trinity and Troit, underneath that you have Kyrie, Gloria in Excelsis Creed, and beside it you have the words Missa de Angelus. Missa de Angelus is one of it was a very popular plain song setting of the historic liturgy, the Kyrie, Gloria, Creed, Sanctus, Agnus Dei, the Missa de Angelus. And it's clear that by sometime in the 30s that was being used. My assumption is that for the Sanctus and the Agnus Dei, they probably used our familiar settings, but I don't know that. In the evening, you'll note that at Vespers, Psalm 6 was sung to tone 2, and the Magnificat was sung with Faux Bourdon by Rowley. That's Alec Rowley, 1892 to 1958. Faux Bourdon, that means a false bass. And what it is, there are four-part settings to accompany plain song. Plain song is, usually there are no parts. It's just the melody line, as we experienced this morning. But the Faux Bourdon is rather lovely. It has these four-part harmonies, and usually every other verse of the Magnificat you would do in the Faux Bourdon. So this gives some insight into what was going on there. And then right next to Vespers, you'll see on Saturday our members will have opportunity to attend the preparatory service. Those who attend these Saturday services will find themselves greatly helped. An opportunity for private confession is given from 7 to 8. So another concern of the society was the restoration of private confession, which had died out. It's a strange thing. Here in Baltimore, in the three old congregations, private confession was very much the thing. And my home parish of Martini, I happened to see a parish paper from 1918, and there was an announcement for communion next Sunday with the note, there will be no private confession. So apparently private confession had died out at Martini by about 1918, but it was in use. The older people at Martini remembered when that was the practice. If you turn the page, you have a thing called At the Eucharist, and this is a photocopy of the card, the card with the order of service in use at St. John's in Hoboken in those days. It's slightly different from the common service. You'll notice that there's an opening versicle, I will go unto the altar of God with exceeding great joy. And that comes from the Latin Mass, in Troibo ad altare Dei, so forth. You'll notice that the Kyrie is given in Greek, so they were apparently already singing the Kyrie in Greek. When we were a German-speaking church, Kyrie eleison was a very familiar word. Any number of hymns in the hymnal concluded with Kyrie eleison. And what's happened in more recent years is that those old German hymns with Kyrie eleison, they've been replaced with an Alleluia. For example, the Christus erstanden, which we sang yesterday, Christ is arisen from the grave's dark prison, so let our joy rise full and flee. Christ our comfort who will be. Kyrie eleison, yes. And also the Kyrie God Father in heaven above, in the Missouri Synod agenda, that's the first item in the divine service, singing Kyrie God Vater in Ewigkeit. So when we were German speaking, Kyrie eleison is a familiar thing, but that's gone. It's gone. So in Greek, and then the Gloria in Excelsis after the intonation, the congregation is seated. That was a custom when in the Roman Catholic Church, very elaborate settings of the Gloria would be sung. If you're familiar with Mozart's masses, Haydn's, Gounod's, those are lengthy settings, and it's just too much to stand all that time. So after the Gloria was intoned, everybody would sit down while the choir gave this concert, as it were.
Yeah, I mean the choir was singing De Angelis there, not the congregation?
That I don't know. I know this, that in von Schenk's day, the congregation was able to sing several plain song settings. The so-called Missa Paschalis, the Missa de Angelis, so I guess the congregation did sing it. And then there were two others, Missa Marialis and one other. It was a remarkable thing, and that was all due to the influence of Carl Bergen, who was born in 1903 and died in the year 2000. He lived to be 97 years old. And he retired as pastor of St. John's, Hoboken in the year of my ordination. And through his kindness, I was able to celebrate my first Holy Eucharist at St. John's, Hoboken, about 2 weeks after I had been ordained at Martini. So I did know Father Bergen. He was a very gracious man. And you can see a good picture of him if you go toward the back of your packet, sort of toward the back. There's a big picture of a bunch of clergy in copes. And in the top row is Rudolf P.F. Restmeyer, the son of the pastor Restmeyer from Baltimore's Emmanuel Church. And next to him is a 25-year-old Richard John Newhouse. And he was just as, what is the adjective for it? Dr. Peephorn once said Peephorn permitted himself to say, yes, Richard can be prickly. Richard can be prickly, but he was a 25-year-old new pastor at St. John's. Next to him is Erwin Prang, who was Newhouse's uncle. And Prang was the last pastor of St. Matthew's Church, which was the African-American church that merged with our Saviour. So Prang became a co-pastor here and then the sole pastor. And then in the front row on the left is Robert Metzger, who was then at a parish in Brooklyn, but he was pastor of our Saviour at the time of the merger, Robert Metzger. Next to him is Thomas Green, who in due course became the dean of the chapel at Concordia, Bronxville. And then there is Father Carl Bergen. He would have been about, 60 at that time. And next to him is a very young Edward Frederick Peters. Perhaps some of you know his doctoral dissertation. It's 600 pages long. And it's a dissertation on the words in the formula of Concord. Nothing has the character of a sacrament apart from the use. Nihil habet rationem sacramenti extra usum a Christo institutum. That was a very young Ed Peters. So that is the Carl Bergen.
Well, and there is misposed statements. Well, where's this information?
St. John the Evangelist in Brooklyn, New York. St. John's, Mauger Street. It was the oldest Lutheran congregation on Long Island. And in 1948, most of the congregation moved to Glendale in Queens, but there were those who stayed on. And in 1948, Pastor Richard Clough came and implemented quite a remarkable liturgical musical ceremonial tradition. And Newhouse was his successor. That St. John's, Mauger Street still is open. They still have a pastor. It still is a mission. Interesting place. It's where I went to church when I was a student at Bronxville. If we can go back toward the beginning again, turn the page. Oh, and interesting, you'll notice this card for the Eucharist. I should have called your attention to another thing. After the Our Father, it says the Sanctus spell is wrong to call our attention to the words of consecration. So they were using the Sanctus spell at that time, and the people knelt for the Verba. There was no Eucharistic prayer at this point, just the Verba. And Holy God, we praise thy name was apparently their invariable closing hymn. That was a custom that another one of the St. James Society people, F.R. Weber, advocated. If you turn the page, there's another picture with Carl Bergen in it. This is a photocopy of an article which appeared in Newsweek magazine in 1934. And the St. James Society met at St. Luke's Church, 46th Street, which is just off Times Square. And sadly, that church went over to the AELC. But the St. James Society had its service there with a solemn choral Eucharist. And in the top row, you see three of the prominent St. James Society clergy. On the left is a very young Theodore Biderweeden, who went on to be pastor of Grace Church in Teaneck, New Jersey, which was a wonderful parish in so many ways. And then a very young Carl Bergen, and next to him a very young Berthold von Schenk. The society was founded in 1929. The first meeting of the society was held at St. John the Baptist, Hoboken in 1933. And there's an article that exists by F.R. Weber which describes what went on. And they had much similar to what we do here. There was a solemn Vespers, there was a solemn choral Eucharist. Now the next picture here, the next page, is of Adolf Wismar. Adolf Wismar. He was from 1918 through 1945, Adolf Wismar was pastor of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in New York City, which is the oldest Lutheran congregation in New York. At least that's how they see themselves. And the reason is that that congregation, which has gone through various incarnations over the years, it still has the charter from the royal governor of New York in 1664. So St. Matthew's, our St. Matthew's Church, which became, the congregation became part of the Missouri Synod in the later part of the 19th century. St. Matthew's was where Wismar was pastor from 1918 to 1945. And while he was there, he studied for a doctorate at Columbia University. And Wismar's dates are 1885 to 1977. He lived to be 92, I believe. Yeah, 92. He was 92 when he died. And he was quite a scholar. I have here a copy of the obituary which appeared in the New York Times when he died in 1977. And among other things, it notes that he had a working knowledge of 18 languages. The older Dr. Wismar had a working knowledge of 18 languages. And he did his studies at Columbia in ancient Near Eastern studies. The obituary says he earned a doctorate in philosophy at Columbia, where his specialty was Oriental languages with an emphasis on ancient Arabic. And you may find the name of his doctoral dissertation perhaps surprising. His doctoral dissertation in 1927 was a study in tolerance as practiced by Mohammed and his successors. We don't usually think of tolerance in connection. Now, I have never read this doctoral dissertation, so I can't inform you of what Dr. Wismar had to say, but that was the topic, a study in tolerance as practiced by Muhammad and his successors. And it was published by Columbia in 1927, but it was reprinted as recently as 1966 by the ASM Press, which is the AMS Press, which is a press which publishes, noteworthy scholarly publications. So the point of that rather lengthy aside is that Wismar was quite a remarkable scholar. I never had the pleasure of meeting him. I did see him once. Paul, did you see him?
I did, yes. He preached in grace at least twice. Once, pretty sure he preached once for like a joint Reformation service. He also preached for the dedication of the building on Tregoney Drive. And one thing I remember, I was only 6 years old when this happened, but one thing I remember was closed circuit TV because they had an overflow crowd into the fellowship hall for that. And that's a church that seats, I'm sure if you crammed them in there, you can get a little more than 300 in there. So I didn't really appreciate what was happening.
Sure. You wouldn't at 6 years old. You don't know who this preacher is. But he was quite a scholar. And then in 1945, Dr. O.P. Kretzmann, who was the longtime president of Valparaiso, he had Dr. Wismar come and teach at Valpo, and he did that for 12 years. And so while he was there, the last meeting of the St. James Society was in 1947 at Valpo, and it has been succeeded by the Liturgical Institute of Valparaiso University, which has rather different programs nowadays. Suffice it to say. On the next page, there is a picture of several people who were associated with the St. James Society. There's another picture of a very young Berthold von Schenk. There's a picture of Frederick Roth Weber, and Pastor Coates spoke at length about Frederick Roth Weber's life and works some time ago, and he was an extremely influential person in the movement, as we'll see when we go on to look at the list of the publications of the society. In the upper right-hand corner is Carl Weidmann. His father, Frederick Weidmann, had been pastor of Trinity Church in St. Louis, our synod's mother church. Fred Weidmann was pastor there. And he was interested in the St. James Society. In fact, in one of the early issues of Pro Ecclesia Lutherana, Frederick Weidmann had an article on the Eucharistic vestments. Carl Weidmann was his son, and Pastor Weidmann was for a while the headmaster at Concordia Prep School, Bronxville. He was, and when I was there, 1959-61, he was still teaching Latin and Greek in the college, so I had him both for Latin and Greek. He published a manual for altar guilds, to which Dr. Wismar wrote the preface. It was published in 1941 and went through several printings and editions. So this was connected with the St. James Society too. And then in the lower right-hand corner of this page, there is a picture of Theodor Grebner. Theodor Grebner taught at St. Louis from 1913 until 1950, the year that he died. And from 1914 to 1949, he was the editor of the Lutheran Witness. So he was, a very influential person in our synod. I mean, the editor of the Lutheran Witness. I mean, every proper Missourian family subscribed to the Lutheran Witness and faithfully read it. And he appeared at the meeting of the St. James Society, which was held at what's called Historic Trinity Church in Detroit, and spoke very sympathetically about the work of the society. He was, in fact, a member of the society, which was really rather remarkable. And in his talk at Historic Trinity Detroit, he said that Dr. Ludwig Furbringer, who was the son of Ottomar Furbringer, one of the Saxon immigrants, that Dr. Ludwig Furbringer believed that the work of the St. James Society was an important work. The next picture is that of Arthur Karl Piepkorn, who published any number of articles in the St. James Society periodical Pro Ecclesia Lutherana. Like Dr. Wismar, Piepkorn's dissertation was in ancient Near Eastern studies. As a seminarian, Piepkorn was very much influenced by the older Walter Meyer, who of course was a great Hebrew scholar and then the Lutheran hour speaker. And Piepkorn was very interested in the Lutheran hour and supportive of it when that got started. And due to Walter Meyer's influence, he went to the University of Chicago to its School of Oriental Studies and got himself a doctorate there. And his doctoral dissertation from 1933 can still be found online. And his dissertation was Historical Prism Inscriptions of Ashurbanipal. Historical Prison Inscriptions of Ashurbanipal, and that was volume 5 of Assyriological Studies. So both of these, well, we would call them great men in the St. James Society, their scholarly interests were really in the Near Eastern studies. It's quite amazing because they were also, their erudition when it came to the history of the church, the confessions, the liturgy was quite astonishing. If you go to the very end of this handout, go to the end, I had mentioned Historic Trinity Church in Detroit, and there are 2 pictures of that. If you found that, one is the interior of the church, and the other is of a clergyman kneeling at the altar, and that is almost certainly Dr. Gilbert Otte, who was pastor there for, I think, close to 50 years. Was it, you know that, Dr. Raymer, yes. You knew Dr. Otte?
Yes, I did. I knew him. I was acquainted with him.
So Dr. Raymer was acquainted with Dr. Otte, and his father had been pastor there too. So it was almost a century of Ottes as pastors at Historic Trinity. But there's a picture there of him kneeling at the altar wearing a chasuble, and the alb he's wearing has an apparel at the lower edge of the alb. It has an apparel on it. Apparels are decorative things that were put on albs and amices in the Middle Ages. historic Trinity. And then the final page is a picture of Grace Lutheran Church in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. And one of the annual meetings of the St. James Society was held there. And that's in part because their pastor for a number of years was Herman W. Bartels. If you look now at the Appendix H, the chronological index of Pro Ecclesia Lutherana, this will be helpful in getting a window into this sort of thing. Yes, if you look down to Pro Ecclesia Lutherana is the publication. I have an old copy of it here from 1935, and that's the one number 3. And you'll notice that in that 1935, Walter Dybe had an article on baptismal rites, Carl Bergen on liturgical music, Adolf Wismar on the common service, and Arthur Karl Pieper on Lutheran influence on Anglican Reform movement. But then in 1936, the first article is by Herman W. Bartels. Yes, Herman, he was pastor of Grace Church, Cleveland. And he went on to be the president of the English district. And I had a note here as to the dates for that. I think it was, he was president of the English district from 1945 to 1951. So the St. James Society, it was not, sometimes it's thought of as a very fringy kind of group, sort of a fringe element.
Well, like God says.
Like ought to be, yeah. And of course, the St. James Society began in Greater New York. I mean, Hoboken's right across the river from New York City. And it was widely thought of as a bunch of Easterners, you know how Easterners are. So, but there were quite a few Midwesterners involved in this whole project as well. And Herman Bartels was, Grace Church was an English district church, and sadly that church no longer exists. It's disappeared, and the building is being used in some way. I don't know. It's a great pity because it's really a magnificent building. I have seen it. I saw it years ago, and I once almost became vacancy pastor there, but that's another story that I'll not bore you with. So, if you look at the chronological index to Pro Ecclesia Lutherana, if you just glance over that, you see the topics that were dealt with, and you see certain names that appear again and again. Walter Dybe wrote a few articles, and he was, among other things, a military chaplain during the Second World War. And when I met him, he was pastor of St. Jacobus Church in Queens, New York, and he too was quite a scholar, as you can see when you read his articles in Pro Ecclesia Lutherana. I recently found out that his BD thesis, now those of you who've been to seminary recently, you all have MDivs, right? Do you all write MDiv theses?
No. You don't. See.
It was still a BD when I went to seminary, and we all had to do a BD thesis, and mine was on Martin Chemnitz's Doctrine of the Ministry. Well, Walter Dybe's BD thesis in 1927, he was roughly the same time as Carl Bergen. His BD thesis was this: The Reformed arguments against the real presence of the body and blood of Christ in the Lord's Supper, examined in the light of the main modern philosophical systems since Locke. The St. Louis Seminary still has all these BD theses online. So I suspect if I read it, it would be a bit over my head. It goes into, this modern philosophical systems, which hard to get your head around. Another name that appears in the first issue of Pro Ecclesia Lutherana is Theodor Hultinickel, who was a great musician. His dates are 1894 to 1986. And he was born in this country, but then his father, who was a Missouri pastor, went to New Zealand and did work as a pastor there. And his son Theodore got a diploma in music theory and piano from the University of Adelaide and Trinity College. He also studied in London and at the conservatory in Leipzig and so forth. In 1928, he was appointed head of the music department at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. Was that an American Lutheran school? Does anybody know?
And that's the old Norwegian Synod school that courses the LC who would be whatever we should, the little Norwegian Synod called the Uppia of 1917.
Yeah, so Hultinickel was, Hultinickel was there. And then during World War II, he became the music director for the Lutheran radio station in St. Louis, KFUO. Everybody who went to the St. Louis Seminary is familiar with KFUO because its base was on the Concordia Seminary. So I was there, and then he became the head of music at Valparaiso. I think it was right after the war. So he was very much an influence there, and you may actually have seen one or two of his publications. There was in several volumes, he published a thing called The Musical Heritage of the Church. And then he also published a wonderful little book. It's called The Little Bach Book. Has anyone ever seen that? It's a wonderful collection about Bach. It addresses Bach's music, his theology, and so forth and so on. In fact, one of the Naumann family, I think it was the old Dr. Martin Naumann, wrote the chapter in that book on Christian doctrine in the works of J.S. Bach. So Hultinickel, too, was involved with the St. James Society. And you can see how they published this rather regularly for a few years, 33, 34, 35, 36, and then 37. And from then on, it sort of diminishes. 1937, Carl Bergen, The Music for Vespers in Compline. I once had a copy of that. It's the plain song setting. Another Walter Dibe. I don't know who Paul Boester is, the Gregorian element in early Lutheran hymnody. And then Walter Dibe did Matins and Vespers according to the German Church. Adolf Wismar did an article on Gregorian rhythms, so apparently among his many gifts, he also was something of a musician. He wrote that. And then Adolf Wismar does a review of Herbert Lindemann's The Psalter in 19 in the late 30s, I can't remember the exact date, I have the book upstairs, Herbert Lindemann published the entire Psalter of the King James Version set to the Gregorian psalm tones. Herb Lindemann was then assistant to his father at Redeemer Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. His father was also president of the English district at the time of his death. So Herb Lindemann published that Psalter, which is a very useful publication. Then the bottom, other major publications, the Music for the Ordinary, I once had a copy of that. The Introits for Latin Easter, I've never seen that. A Liturgy for the Celebration of the Holy Eucharist. This was Wismar's own effort at putting together a Lutheran liturgy for the Eucharist. And when you look through the St. James Society's publications, one of their great interests was in restoring the Eucharistic prayer to the Lutheran liturgy. And they had several proposals of texts for that, one of them being the one in Dr. Wismar's 1947. I have a copy of that, but I can't put my finger on it. I probably put it in a safe place. And that's always a very dangerous thing to do. But it's an interesting rite. Yes, they were quite concerned about that. I've been talking on and on. Are there any questions that came to mind as I was rattling on about the St. James Society? Pastor MacDonald, he now has found all the issues of Pro Ecclesia Lutherana online. Could you say something about that? And it's because you got it through Eric Wismar, who I believe is a grandson.
So he's the grandson. I graduated some with him 2002. And he, at one point, had them all uploaded, I guess, to his site on the New Fairfield Church in Connecticut. Anyhow, he forwarded them to me, so I sent them to Father Charles, and there they are. They're just all in attachments, yeah. So they're all around. They're not in print form, but they're...
I managed to find the very first issue online and printed it out, so I have the whole first line. Yes, Leo.
I'm interested in this Saturday preparatory service. How would that have been?
I think we can safely assume that it was what in the 1941 hymnal is called the confessional service. I mean, there was a time in our synod whenever Holy Communion was celebrated in the divine service, there was a preparatory service. Sometimes it was held on Saturday evening. More commonly, it was held like a half hour early on Sunday morning. And that was still done at Martini Church, Baltimore, into the 1930s. So it was, I mean, it's in a sense a substitute for private confession and absolution. In other words, instead of people going to private confession, there was the confessional service. And if you have a copy of the Lutheran hymnal, you'll find that in there. And if my memory serves me correctly, doesn't the LSB has a form for corporate confession? Yes, Doug.
Preparatory office, page 46 in TLH.
Right.
That persisted at First Trinity through Lawrence Blankenmueller's time, which was the late 70s, early 80s. They were doing it about a half hour before the divine service.
So that late, it was still, so that's the service. But The LSB does have, isn't it called corporate confession and absolution?
Correct that if you were going to communion, it was expected that you would go
Yes.
also to the service.
Yeah.
Not everyone would be receiving communion, but if you were, you were required to go to the preparatory service. It was expected.
Right, you had to do that. And that died out at Martini. I don't know when. My guess is during I don't know. I was going to say during the Second World War, but I'm not sure. But what happened once that disappeared is the confession and absolution was in the divine service itself, where it is to this day. Yeah. The idea is that we will, in future St. Mark's conferences, explore the work of the St. James Society in some more detail. The name of the society, one of you can surely tell me why they chose the name St. James.
The liturgy of the Eastern Church.
Yeah, the Liturgy of St. James. There's a legend that was a liturgy which was put together by St. James of Jerusalem, the brother of the Lord. But that is a legend. There's no evidence for that. It's quite later. And among the Eastern Orthodox, the Liturgy of St. James is still done in some places on the Feast of St. James of Jerusalem. But they named, the society called itself St. James because of that legend. In the other large Lutheran synod, the United Lutheran Church in America, there was a similar society. It was called the Society of St. Ambrose, and its members were called Ambrosians. And the great leader of that society was Arthur Gregory Marcel, who was pastor of the Church of the Transfiguration in Philadelphia. And he had quite an influence on seminarians at the Philadelphia Lutheran Seminary. And the Philadelphia faculty was not entirely happy about that. I think they viewed him as corrupting the youth. So, but that was Father Marcel at Transfiguration Church.
David says that, this is 1934.
Yes.
And down at the bottom paragraph, the last full paragraph on the left-hand side says, some Lutherans at the conference were surprised to read in the program that confessions will be heard at 5:30 p.m. Wednesday. And then a paper was read about confession being a part of sound Lutheranism. The Augsburg Confession says we will maintain confession. It would be against God to do away with absolution.
Yes.
I mean, the interesting thing about that is in 1934 it was a big surprise, but it's in the original constitution of the Missouri Synod that every congregation will have private confession absolution. I think the interesting story to hear would be what happened from 1850 to 1900, where this practice was only became something that was not even conceived.
Yeah. Well, if I remember correctly, the Constitution said that if a pastor comes to a congregation and finds private confession in use, he must maintain it. He must. And if it is not in use, he must work to introduce it. And I think that in some places it was done, in other places not. Here in Baltimore, the mother parish, St. Paul's, I had once a copy of a memorial booklet for Pastor Hanser. Greg, do you remember when Pastor Hanser was? I think it was the late 19th century. Johannes Hanser. Okay, Hanser. And in this memorial booklet, he died like around in July, But it mentions that on Easter Eve of that day, he had spent the entire day hearing confessions. And older members at Martini remembered when everyone was expected to go to private confession before communion. They did not necessarily enumerate sins, but they had to go to private confession. And that apparently continued at Martini till about 1918. But my guess is, and it's only a guess, is that this varied widely in city. Now, for example, St. Lorenz Church in Frankenmuth, the history there is that until 1900 or so, private confession was the only kind of confession there was. There was no general confession of absolution. So St. Lorenz had that. And of course, they also had a weekly celebration of the sacrament in those days, which goes back, I'm sure, to the Lea Foundation. But no, your question, how did it, I mean, if at one time, even Synods Constitution was very definite about it, how did that, when and how did that all change? And I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, my guess is that congregations may have lost it as the transition to English was made, because then the church's mission was among, typical American Protestants this would be utterly foreign, inconceivable to them.
And just a point of, maybe that was what you were alluding to. There was a question regarding the original Constitution, and it's in some of the history books. The question was, what about general confession? That was the real question. So it was, can we have general confession? Is that allowed? And as I remember the resources, the basic answer of the Synod was that it's to be tolerated, but if you can eliminate general confession, you should. In favor of private confession and absolution. It can coexist, but if you can eliminate it, try to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's my impression of how that was. Any other questions? I guess yes.
I was curious, is there any knowledge of how widespread it got at its peak, so to say? Yeah.
I really can't answer that. But when you say how widespread it got, are you asking, how many congregations there were who adopted it?
Just some way connected to it.
My impression is the number is few.
Right.
And I think most of us would know the names of some of the places where this was implemented.
But they did have desires to become wider and
Yes.
not to become necessarily the norm in Synod, but to...
I mean, one of their goals was to have a parish that implemented the society's ideas in every major city, a parish in every major city, but that never happened. Yes.
They ended in 1947.
Because the St. James Society at that time was, the headquarters was Valpo, because Dr. Wismar was there. And after the 1947 meeting, Dr. Kretzmann, O.P. Kretzmann, thought that this is something that the university should take on, that the university should continue the work of the St. James Society. And part of his thought came from the way in the Church of England the Tractarian movement, the beginnings of the so-called Catholic revival. You know, that began at Oxford. So O.P. Cretsen was thinking, well, you know, we'll have it here at Valpo, and Valpo will make this possible. And so by 1949, there was the first Liturgical Institute at Valparaiso University. So what happened was that the Valpo Liturgical Institute became the successor of the St. James Society. And I have here the book which has the articles, the papers that were given at that first meeting at Valpo in 1949. Unsurprisingly, Adolf Wismar gave one of the papers, and it was an essay on the liturgy of the Eucharist by Adolf Wismar. Carl Bergen had an article on the pastor's part of the liturgy, and then an essay on the music of the liturgy was delivered by Dr. Bixel, who was at Valpo at that time, and he was a protege of Theodor Holtenickel. He was part of that whole thing. So Bixel, and then another person who was on the faculty in those days was Jaroslav Pelikan. When my cousin Elise taught at Valpo, Pelikan and Wismar were there. And Pelikan gave a paper on form and tradition in worship. Form and tradition. This is the first Valpo Liturgical Institute. So basically what happened is that Dr. Kretzmann thought the thing to do would be, I think there was the thought it would give it a sort of a solid base. Events have not quite turned out that way. If you've seen any of the programs for the more recent liturgical institutes, some of it is, shall I say, exotic. It's a very different kind of thing. And also what happened with the Society of St. James was a Missouri Synod organization, but the Valpo Liturgical Institute, almost from the beginning, was intentionally pan-Lutheran. It was a pan-Lutheran thing. And indeed, the whole liturgical movement in American Lutheranism back in the 40s, 50s, it was very much pan-Lutheran, partly because in those days the other synods had not departed so far from any resemblance of being Lutheran. So a pan-Lutheran thing was a more doable kind of thing. But then it was pan-Lutheran, and then it became more ecumenical. There were Anglicans and Roman Catholics, and various people were involved in the programs of the Liturgical Institute. Of course, in the 1960s, you have the Second Vatican Council, and that, of course, completely changed the liturgy in the Western Church, Roman and otherwise. So the Valpo Liturgical Institute is kind of a successor state to the St. James Society, and initially it was much like St. James. Yes?
You had just mentioned that Theodor Graeber was the head of the Lutheran Witness.
Yes.
It'd be interesting to go back during his time period. He was the individuals who would allow certain articles to be published.
Yes.
And I was told in this period that this was the period where the articles first started to be written about every Sunday communion. That early in that's in the book by Weeding. He documents how in the Lutheran Witness in this time period, the frequency of Holy Communion started to be addressed, I think, already in the 20s and 30s. So I'm just the question was asked about the influence. It could be that someone like Theodore Grebner was allowing articles to be published that carried with it the thoughts of the St. James Society.
And what was the book you referenced?
Wheating's book on every Sunday communion.
Oh, yes, I have a copy of that.
So he references the conversation in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod over every Sunday communion. And his point specifically is that this was a conversation that already began in the 1920s in the Lutheran Witness, long before we were saying every Sunday communion. The Lutheran Church was saying we got to get away from just quarterly communion, and that it was a 100-year process, not as some people think, a few people who were graduating from the seminary saying we should do this.
Back in Walther's day, Trinity Church St. Louis, apparently it was every other Sunday at Trinity Church. But the influence of the society, in the preparation of the Lutheran hymnal of 1941, both Adolf Wismar and Carl Bergen served on subcommittees on the liturgy for that hymnal. And Carl Bergen almost succeeded in persuading them to put a plain song setting of the liturgy in the Lutheran hymnal. But apparently what happened at the last minute, it was decided there wasn't room for it. And Adolf Wismar, in fact, proposed a form of Eucharistic prayer, which was considered by the committee preparing the liturgical materials, but that was rejected at the time. But both Bergen and Wismar were involved in the Lutheran hymnal project. And I would guess Grebner had something to do with that. Yes.